கொஞ்சம் எக்ஸ்ட்ரீமா காமிக்கிறாங்க.
ஐ மீன் இத பேஸ் பண்ணி காமிச்சிருக்கவே கூடாதா? வேற நார்மலா ஓகே whatever she was suffering okay she can tell him different. அவர் அதாவது வீட்டுல யாராவது வந்திருக்கலாம் அந்த மாதிரி ஏதாவது காமிச்சிருக்கோம். இதை வச்சு காமிச்சாங்க தெரியல.
பப்படப்பா I told you not she'll suicide.
வெளியில தாப்பால் போட்டு போயிட்டா. உள்ளேயும் இந்த ரெண்டு சைடுமே தாப்பால்.
See, it's a matter of communication properly. ஒண்ணும் பண்ணாம சும்மா அப்படியே
Okay. Give me a minute. Just open the door. Nectar. Okay. नमो विष्णुपादाय कृष्ण प्रेष्ठाय भूतले श्रीमते भक्तिवेदांत स्वामिनिधि नमस्ते सारस्वती देवी गौरवाणी प्रचारिणे निर्विशेष शून्यादि पाश्चात्य देश उद्धारिणे. Prabhupada nectar as a basis to it. When Satsarup Maharaj compiled his biography of Prabhupada Lilamrita, he conducted several interviews, and he followed the method of counter-checking the various stories that are told for verification. And then based on that, he worked out a biography, which stands practically unparalleled in its extent, scope, and depth, and also accuracy. So after he completed the 6 volumes, some additional pastimes of Prabhupada also he presented in the form of Prabhupada Leela, which will be integrated. Prabhu, when he teaches, he will also integrate those pastimes in a chronological fashion. Then there were further content remaining from the interviews, and those came out through this Prabhupada Nectar. There were 5 small little red books. That is how they were published earlier on. And then later, all of them were put together and printed in a single volume. So this is really good to read through, and very, very inspiring. 5 volumes, as you can see. So I'll start by reading out and explaining as things go by. The 6-volume biography, Srila Prabhupada Leelamrita, did not by any means exhaust the stock of stories, reflections, praises, and quotations that may be usefully gathered and printed about His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. As one cannot exhaust the glories of the infinite personality of Godhead, similarly, one cannot come to the end of worthy descriptions of His pure devotees. If there is a limit, it is only in the recollective powers of His followers or in the size of the audience capable of relishing the transcendental topics of Krishna and His eternal associates. In the Srila Prabhupada Leelamrita, as well as its vertical synopsis, remembering Srila Prabhupada, I mostly confine myself to the chronological sequence of main events in Prabhupada's life. But there is much more. Let us open the floodgates. The only restrictions now are authenticity of the anecdotes, considerations of etiquette, and the desire to print the stories and meditations in a readable literary form. Otherwise, all Prabhupada Katha is beneficial for the hearer and capable of producing transcendental bliss. We therefore present the first small volume of Prabhupada Nectar and hope it will be followed frequently with further collections. Our search to gather true Prabhupada Nectar is ongoing and very much dependent on others. The anecdotes and realizations are gathered from disciples and friends of Srila Prabhupada. So we request all readers who know of any unpublished incidents about Prabhupada to kindly grant us an interview or send us notes of your recollections. You should remember at this time, Prabhupada disciples were by and large the core membership of ISKCON at this time. So he is writing to them. Within this poor world, there are relatively few reservoirs of Prabhupada memories. And so we repeatedly request such fortunate persons to be kind upon thousands of readers now and in the future by contributing their memories to Prabhupada Nectar. Even if one is planning to write his own memoirs in his old age, that should not rule out giving an interview for use in this series. Better it be recorded as soon as possible before it disappears through time's deterioration. I have not attempted to compile the Prabhupada Nectar in encyclopedia form by rigidly grouping the entries under numerous categories. In the telling, we have chosen to intersperse the different kinds of material, providing more variety for reading and resembling more the way Prabhupada distributed his teachings in life. Prabhupada did not speak all at one time about politics, and then all about yoga, and then all about the demigods. But he gave some here and some there. To encourage me in this method, Jayadvaita Swami remarked, in this way it resembles life. A few words here, a few gestures there, or sometimes a whole lot all at once. In presenting the anecdotes, I have not altered any facts, but I have often rewritten them into a narrative form, or sometimes edited or polished what was given to me. For variety, I have created categories like Prabhupada said. consisting of direct quotes on specific subjects. Prabhupada tells a story and personal. Further volumes may contain further varieties of talks by and about Prabhupada. At the back of the book are notes. They give a reference for the source of each entry. And there I have also added occasional comments. For over 6 years, our Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita staff of interviewers and researchers have been practicing a system of ascertaining whether a Prabhupada anecdote is authentic. And I have applied the same standards in Prabhupada Nectar. By researching tape recordings of Srila Prabhupada, we try to give accurate quotes of his statements wherever possible. We also look for several reliable witnesses, in addition to the one who's recalling a particular event. This is done by our interviewer bringing up the same incident in numerous interviews. While we always feel more confident in hearing anecdotes from senior disciples who are leaders and active members of the Krishna consciousness movement, we do not absolutely exclude hearing from other disciples as long as they are favorable and not envious of Srila Prabhupada, not malicious. In fact, the phenomenon of interviewing a devotee of Srila Prabhupada is itself a remarkable testimony in gauging the authenticity of remembrances of Srila Prabhupada. Experiencing strong emotions, including pains of remembrance and grief at their distance from Prabhupada, devotees sometimes cry for the first time in years, and they often later thank us for helping them to remember Prabhupada. When they are absorbed in such interviews, it seems that the covering of years of forgetfulness is pulled back, at least temporarily, and the devotee obtains again the mercy of Prabhupada's association through remembrance. A trained interviewer can appreciate these positive symptoms, but he also learns to spot inconsistencies in context when remembrances are inaccurate. Furthermore, each devotee seems to contain his own repertoire of Prabhupada's stories, which he tends to remember again and again. This is something that when you meet Prabhupada disciples, you notice this phenomenon. These set remembrances indicate to us that certain Prabhupada remembrances are permanently etched into the brains of the witnesses. Even if sometimes the same event in Prabhupada's life is viewed in a variety of ways from person to person, still the remembrances are personal, lasting exchanges between Prabhupada and the particular persons. Many Prabhupada stories have already entered into an oral tradition and are passed down from hearer to hearer in a disciplined succession, in which the original source may not always be recalled. These can also be accepted as well as evaluated for authenticity by persons familiar with Prabhupada's life and philosophy. Thus, while we have given specific references for the source of each incident in this book, the incidents are usually not dependent on only one person, but are part of a collective tradition. While we cannot claim that our selection system is infallible, we have often refrained from telling an apparently instructive incident because it was weak in authenticity. We are definitely against spinning any concocted yarns about Srila Prabhupada and have done our best to exclude the make-believe. There are already books in the form of anecdotes, like anecdotes from Gandhiji's life, anecdotes from Abraham Lincoln, and Lincoln stories, and anecdote collections about authors, institutions, and countries. Such collections are considered especially memorable because of their ability to capture real-life glimpses of great persons. But Prabhupada Nectar is unique in importance because Srila Prabhupada was empowered to deliver the highest transcendental science, pure love of Krishna, based on the teachings of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. And he delivered it more widely and more effectively than any predecessor. In Chaitanya Mangal, there is a prediction that Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is stating that I will send my commander-in-chief devotee, Senapati Bhakta, to those souls who have gone to faraway lands. This is Prabhupada. Remarkably, he did so during the era of the greatest faithlessness and strife known as the age of Kali. Therefore, hearing even small incidents from his life is more beneficial than hearing the greatest public acts of all worldly heroes and benefactors. As it is stated in the Shastras, even a moment's association with the pure Vaishnava can grant liberation from the cycle of birth and death. Since even a drop of nectar from the life of Srila Prabhupada can save one from suffering, we are trying to deliver many drops to irrigate this desert-like universe. Okay, we'll start with the first anecdote. From Swamiji to Prabhupada. It was only after 2 years of leading ISKCON in America that Srila Prabhupada agreed to be addressed by the proper title, Prabhupada, instead of Swamiji. As early as 1960, in his first volume of Srimad Bhagavatam, he had written in a purport, the pure devotees, whose only business is serving, are honored by the names Prabhupada and Vishnupad, which indicates such devotees to be representatives of the lotus feet of the Lord. Yet although the term Swamiji is common and not very respectful, it was the only name his followers knew. And it had become a most endearing term for them. They inquired and prayed to him by that name, and they addressed all their letters, Dear Swamiji. So it was a bit of a shock when the name was changed. One devotee, on hearing the new name from Srila Prabhupada's secretary, couldn't accept it without personally asking Srila Prabhupada. In the next morning walk, he inquired, Swamiji? Yes, Prabhupada replied. I understand that you prefer to be called Prabhupada. Prabhupada turned quickly. Where did you hear this? Who told you this? Prabhupada appeared annoyed. Then he became silent. And after a few moments, he spoke again. Actually, I do not prefer, but it is better. That's from an interview. I think these are actually notes. Let's quickly check. This is the first chapter. Yes, so he has integrated the notes in the database. This is actually notes, which in this edition comes earlier on. Aniruddha Das, interview. The distinction is between a preference as seen as one's will or opinion and the higher principle of doing what is best in devotion service. It had become best for Swamiji to accept the more honorable title Prabhupada. Swamiji was a nice name for our innocent beginning days, but it was more fit that the founder Acharya of the most important movement in the world be known by his more glorious and accurate name as the Master, at whose feet the other masters sit. So Prabhupada is not just our master, he's a master of our masters. And it is not that he's the only master, he's a master of the masters. So we have our spiritual masters whom we should honor and obey, but they are also obedient to Prabhupada. He is our Supreme Court. Donuts, a diamond in Prabhupada's eye. In San Francisco in 1967, Srila Prabhupada only gradually raised the standards of his followers. Most of them were not much more than hippies, having a good time eating and singing in the storefront. Right next to the temple was an ice cream shop. At the end of the street, there was a donut shop, both frequented by devotees. Unless there was a specific function in the temple, many of the devotees could be found in one of the two food shops. Therefore, when Prabhupada would come down from his apartment, he would sometimes pass very slowly in front of the ice cream shop to see if any of his followers were there. Then he would go down to the donut shop and look in the window there. The devotees would even slink down in their seats so as not to be spotted as Srila Prabhupada looked in. More than once in the evening lecture, Srila Prabhupada mentioned that devotees don't take part in eating in ice cream shops or eating donuts, but they eat only Krishna Prasadam. Ahar Shuddho Sattva Shuddhi. The Acharyas point out in their commentaries to Bhagavad Gita, and also in commentaries to the Vedanta Sutra, that practitioners of spiritual life, Bhakti Yoga, they have to have pure eating habits, because if we eat foodstuffs cooked by non-devotees, then that affects our consciousness. Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu mentioned in Chaitanya Charitamrita, Vishayi Ramna Khaile Molin Hoy Mon, Molin Mone Na Hoy Krishna Mon. If we eat foodstuffs cooked by sense enjoyers, then our mind becomes contaminated. With a contaminated mind, we cannot remember Krishna. Very important principle. All the four Vaishnava lines, they talk about this. Standard acharyas, they always emphasize this. From the very beginning of his preaching in America, Prabhupada used to encourage his devotees to take part in the devotional ecstasy of chanting and dancing. On morning walks, he would sometimes ask each devotee, "Were you chanting last night?" Referring to the congregational kirtan in the temple. "I tried to, but there wasn't any room," one devotee replied. Garga Muni said, "No, because I was afraid I would cry." No doubt these remarks by his disciples contained neophyte emotions. Yet Srila Prabhupada replied, "Seriously, when you are with ordinary people," he said, "then you should not cry, because they will not understand. But when you are with devotees, you can cry, because the devotees will know that you're crying for Krishna." And Prabhupada also demonstrated this crying. Once, during the Sunday feast program, the devotees enacted the drama of Narada Muni's rescuing the hunter Mrigari. Vishnu Jan Das played Narada, and when he recited verses from the prayers to the spiritual master, everyone could notice something shining in the corner of Prabhupada's eye. He had a tear in his eye, but it was particularly shining, like a diamond. After Prabhupada left the temple, many devotees were commenting, "Did you see the diamond in Prabhupada's eye?" Nandarani Mataji, Umapati Prabhu. Prabhupada gave many strong warnings that such tearful emotions should never be imitated or induced. We should not cry like the Sahajiyas, whose tears wash away all scriptural injunctions. Real crying is described in the Nectar of Devotion. In other words, one should learn how to cry for the Lord. One should learn this simple technique. He should be very eager and actually cry to become engaged in some particular type of service. This is called laulyam. And such tears are the prize for the highest perfection. Fresh kachoris take priority. Srila Prabhupada's servant was having difficulty controlling his senses. He asked Prabhupada to give him a special diet. When word got around that Prabhupada had recommended a special diet, another devotee approached Prabhupada for similar treatment. "Prabhupada, is there anything I could get that would help me control my tongue more? Are there certain things to avoid like sugar?" Prabhupada said, the method to control the tongue is to chant and to pray. Well, the devotee said, "I'm chanting and praying, but still I'm having difficulty." Prabhupada sat back in his seat and laughed. "Yes," he said, "I know. I have a tongue too. It may be difficult, but as much as you can, try to eat simply." Prabhupada went on to describe how during World War II, there was a bombing of Calcutta, during a time when Prabhupada was just about to honor prasadam. Friends had come running to the house giving warning. "Abhay Charan, come quickly. The air raid siren is going off. The bombs are coming." Prabhupada had responded by saying that he could not go because his wife had just prepared some kachoris. He told his friends, "You go to the shelter. I will stay here." And so he offered the kachoris, ate them, chanted Hare Krishna. Prabhupada said that he had a tongue, but he did not say that he had an uncontrolled tongue. The Krishna conscious Siddhanta is that the tongue should be used in the service of Krishna. Sevan mukhe ki jikhwado. One cannot realize Krishna or Krishna's name with the blunt senses, but only when one purifies his consciousness by engaging in Bhakti Yoga, beginning with the tongue. Prabhupada describes this higher principle of renunciation in the Nectar of Devotion. Srila Rupa Goswami then recommends that one should not be attached to material sense enjoyment, but should accept everything enjoyable, which is in relationship to Krishna. For example, eating is necessary, and one wants some palatable dishes to satisfy his sense of taste. So in that case, for the satisfaction of Krishna, rather than for the satisfaction of the tongue, some palatable dishes may be prepared and offered to Krishna. Then it is renunciation. Let the palatable dishes be prepared, but unless they are offered to Krishna, one should not accept them for eating. This vow of rejecting anything which is not offered to Krishna is actually renunciation. And by such renunciation, one is able to satisfy the demands of the senses. Bald heads versus bad legs. Regarding this Prabhupada title, there is something else also which I think I would like to show. Here. The title Prabhupada is offered to a spiritual master, especially to this is Prabhupada's own purport. Chaitanya Charitamrita Adi 10.7. Regarding the title Prabhupada. The title Prabhupada is offered to a spiritual master, especially to a distinguished spiritual master such as Srila Rupa Goswami Prabhupada, Srila Jiva Goswami Prabhupada, or Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami Prabhupada. When our disciples similarly wanted to address their spiritual master as Prabhupada, some foolish people became envious, not considering the propaganda work of the Hare Krishna movement. Simply because these disciples addressed their spiritual master as Prabhupada, they became so envious that they formed a faction along with other such envious persons just to minimize the value of the Krishna consciousness movement. To chastise such fools, Krishna's Kaviraj Goswami very frankly says, Eho Gori Vare Nare Jeshtaloko Crown. All the great personalities in the line of Lord Chaitanya enumerated these devotees, but they could not distinguish between the greater and the lesser. Anyone who is a bona fide preacher of the cult of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu must be respectful to the real devotees of Lord Chaitanya. One should not be envious, considering one preacher to be very great and another to be very lowly. This is a material distinction and has no place on the platform of spiritual activities. Krishna's Kaviraj Goswami is that therefore offers equal respect to all the preachers of the cult of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu who are compared to the branches of the tree. ISKCON is one of these branches and it should therefore be respected by all sincere devotees of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. The controversy, if at all you want to refer to it as a controversy, was in the minds of some devotees who were devoted to Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was given the title Prabhupada. And there was this idea that he alone should be referred to as Prabhupada. None of his disciples should be referred to as Prabhupada. In Mayapur, when Prabhupada's god brothers came and asked him, why do you call yourself Prabhupada? He immediately asked a disciple to bring out his letter pad, stationery, and showed Dandi Goswami, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami. There was no Prabhupada there. And he said, I don't call myself Prabhupada. I refer to myself as Bhaktivedanta Swami. And they became satisfied to some extent. So Prabhupada was not glorifying himself, but at the same time, when a person is of a particular status, Krishna wants to expose his glories. That cannot be prevented also. Okay. Section 4. Bald heads versus bare legs. One evening in Bhaktivedanta Manor in London, Srila Prabhupada was sitting in his room with his disciples and a few guests, including a woman reporter who had come to interview Srila Prabhupada. Despite the chilly English summer weather, the reporter was dressed in a scanty miniskirt. Her first few questions revealed her skeptical and almost cynical attitude towards the Hare Krishna movement. As usual, Srila Prabhupada coolly and expertly answered her questions. Somewhat exasperated and in a challenging mood, she brought up the old question, why do you people have bald heads? Srila Prabhupada immediately retorted, why do you have bare legs? He was speechless. Srila Prabhupada then offered, better to have warm legs and a cool head. Everyone, including the reporter, laughed with delight. Prabhupada added, you must have a cool head to understand this Krishna consciousness philosophy. Prabhupada knew what he was doing. He gave a certain appearance. He gave a system by which we can progress in Krishna consciousness, which will naturally involve automatically and naturally without any effort. It will bring about a good character. And Prabhupada wanted that certain features be kept as they are. Prabhupada gave certain prescriptions, certain prohibitions, certain allowances. There's no need for us to reinvent the wheel and think about what, if he has allowed devotees to have a certain appearance and for a particular circumstance, it's not our duty to unnecessarily Indianize it. But like inside the temple room, Prabhupada has a particular dress code for devotees. That's how it's meant to be. That's it. We don't need to become the next Prabhupada. It's given the instructions, it's our duty to follow it. Because of the moonlight, vegetables have taste. During an early morning walk in Vrindavan, devotees were asking Srila Prabhupada about the moon. A pale reminder of the moon could still be seen in the sky, and various birds were cooing and calling from the trees. Prabhupada said the moon is shining and therefore has heat, and yet its effect on the earth is cooling. Vishakha was one of the few women who regularly accompanied Srila Prabhupada on his walks because of her assignment as a photographer. On this occasion, she stopped taking pictures and walked closer to ask Prabhupada a question about the moon. Prabhupada, it is stated in your Bhagavad Gita purport that because of the moonlight, vegetables have taste. So why is it that the moon makes the vegetables have flavor? Prabhupada stopped walking to consider her question. His demeanor was mellow and soft, but his look penetrated into her eyes. Why don't you ask him? Was his only reply. And then he walked on. Srila Prabhupada's reply was unexpected. Instead of telling why the moon gave taste, he replied in effect, why don't you ask the moon yourself? Another expert way of teaching. When a disciple asked too many detailed inquiries about the nature of life in the spiritual world, Srila Prabhupada replied that when you will actually go to the spiritual world, then you can see these things for yourself. When a devotee asked why Lord Shiva appeared as Shankaracharya, Prabhupada replied, you have no right to question Lord Shiva's activities. In this way, Prabhupada detected dubious mentalities in the questioners. It is a spiritual master's duty to first of all rectify the attitude of his disciple. Attitude is very, very important. In the Nectar of Instruction, in the preface, Prabhupada makes this important statement. Advancement in Krishna consciousness is dependent on the attitude of the following. Attitude means many things. I generally state on the basis of Bhaktivinoda Thakur's method of presentation called Dashamul, that there are 4 aspects to Krishna consciousness. One is Shraddha, faith, conviction. Another is Pragya, understanding, comprehension. Another is Spriha, aspiration, ambition, desires. And the last is Kriya, activities, applied activities. When you apply Krishna consciousness in the form of activities. So out of these, the first three constitute attitude. We need to have the right type of conviction. As long as we are in ignorance, we cannot avoid faith and conviction. But when one attains Bhava Bhakti, Prema Bhakti, Bhava Bhakti is the beginning of direct experience of the Supreme Lord. So that would constitute the first full-fledged, clear verification of various aspects of Krishna consciousness. Prema Bhakti is full-fledged, fully immersed in knowledge. So then there is no need for faith and so on at that stage. Faith is only required to whatever extent we are in ignorance. But that is one layer, faith. Understanding, that's another layer. Then aspirations and different ambitions. We are, if we want to progress and attain the highest perfection of Bhakti, we need to have absolute, unbreakable faith in the scriptures and in the conclusions of the scriptures as well, regarding Sambandha, Avideya, and Prayojana. Vishnu Chakravarti Thakur points that out in his commentary to Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. While Rupa Goswami discusses the three levels of candidates for pure devotional service: Kanishtadhikari, Madhyamadhikari, Uttamadhikari. The Kanishtadhikari has faith, but it is tender faith. But Vishnu Chakravarti Thakur says it's tender faith, but still it is unbreakable faith. If one does not have unbreakable faith in all aspects of Krishna Bhakti, then he says the person is not even, he's not even a bhakta, he's not a bhakti yogi at all. So faith is one important component. Then comes understanding. We need to have a clear understanding of Krishna consciousness. We also need to have the right type of desires. So this constitutes attitude, and we have the wrong type of attitude. Even if we execute the activities of Krishna consciousness, it will not work. Vishnu Chakravarti Thakur notes in his Bhagavad Gita commentary, chapter 16, towards the end, that if a person has doubts about some very fundamental doubts he has, even if he executes the 64 items of bhakti in Bhakti Yoga, it will not yield the desired results. So these are all very important. So therefore, Prabhupada first of all dealt with attitudes, then dealt with all these answers to these questions and so on, all these other things. And because he was always in touch with Krishna, Krishna was using him to answer. As the waterfall sometimes flows and sometimes does not, so the pure devotee may speak or be silent, or he may make an enigmatic reply. In any case, we learn from him. If I remember correctly, this comes in one particular chapter in the 10th canto, where it is stated that saintly authorities, they sometimes speak and sometimes they choose not to speak. They're not obliged. Prabhupada said on prasadam, regarding prasadam, leftovers should always be taken if they have not spoiled or if they have not been touched by a diseased person. We should never waste Krishna prasadam. Best thing is to cook only what is required and then give each person what he wants. That is Vedic system. That the people sit in rows behind their plates and servers pass down the rows and put a very small portion of each foodstuff on each plate. Unless there is some objection by a person, then nothing is given. Then if anyone wants more, the servers pass up and down the rows continually and give more if anyone requests. In this way, nothing is wasted and everyone is satisfied. In India, Prabhupada instructed the devotees how a gentleman would eat and how to feed guests who come to the temple. During the meal, the host should be very attentive to his guests' needs, supplying them servings of hot puris, fresh water, and more of everything. He should also engage his guest in light, relaxing conversation and not heavy, anxiety-producing topics. In Mayapur, Prabhupada showed this. It appears to me that in Vrindavan also Prabhupada demonstrated, other places also. Prabhupada said that rice was useless unless served hot. He also said reheating rice must never be done since it causes a poisonous effect. So far as offering to Krishna apple cider, this can be done only if it is prepared by the devotees. These food manufacturers do not take proper precautions in cleanliness, nor do they have devotion for Krishna in their labors. So it is not a very acceptable offering. If you can make this preparation yourself, then it will be all right. The letter regarding leftover prasadam was by Prabhupada to Kirtiraj Prabhu. The information about how a gentleman should eat was given by Jayaprataka Maharaj. The information about Prabhupada's opinion on rice was from Palika Mataji. The letter about apple cider was addressed to Rukmini Mataji. Palika Mataji was an expert cook. We are repeatedly told. Prabhupada tells a story during Srila Prabhupada's last days in Vrindavan. He used to be carried up and down the stairs in a palanquin chair. His habit was to take a rest during the day in his bed on the roof. One day, going up the narrow staircase from the first floor to the roof, Shatatanya Maharaj carried the rear portion of Prabhupada's palanquin by its two handles, and another man carried the front. Krishna Goswami led the group, and Upendra Das followed, carrying Prabhupada's drinking lota and quilt. Suddenly, Srila Prabhupada began to laugh uncontrollably. The devotees were amazed because Srila Prabhupada was very ill and had been silent and grave. Do you want to hear a funny story? He asked. They all answered, yes, Srila Prabhupada. Let us go upstairs. There I can say. While Upendra rushed to get his tape recorder, the others brought Srila Prabhupada to the roof, placed him on his bed, and sat at his feet. Srila Prabhupada's body was very gaunt from the months of fasting, and he lay back but continued laughing. That's a Bengali proverb, he said. Garib Manush Chinga Kai Bhakta Gelo Gode Jai. Just to say it made Prabhupada laugh more. The devotees remained mystified and expectant. Now I'll explain, said Srila Prabhupada. Garib Manush. Garib means poor and Manush means man. Again, Srila Prabhupada broke into laughter, his thin body shaking and his whole face smiling. Chachinga Khai, he continued. Chachinga means grasshopper. Khai, eats. So this poor man has nothing to eat except he's finding some grasshoppers and eating them. Garib Manush, Chachinga Khai, Bhakta Gelo. But when he wants to pass stool, Gode Jai, he rides on a big white horse. Prabhupada laughed loudly, and all the devotees sat by in amazement. Then Prabhupada turned to Upendra and said, you understand? Upendra's face became red in non-understanding. Shatadanya Maharaj was thinking, I hope Prabhupada does not ask me. Shatadanya turned to Tamal Krishna Maharaj and whispered, Tamal, do you understand? Tamal Krishna Maharaj gave an unsure nod and said, yes, but he remained silent. Prabhupada said, just see, Garib Manush. He's a poor man, eating only grasshoppers. But when he goes to pass stool, he rides a big white horse. When Prabhupada saw that they could not understand, he explained further. Similarly, I am a sannyasi. So a sannyasi is a beggar, a poor man. I am a poor man. And yet when I have to go to sleep, then 4 men must carry me in a palanquin. In this way, they all laughed and enjoyed Prabhupada's story, but not quite as much as did Prabhupada himself. This is from an interview with Shatadanya Maharaj. Shatadanya Maharaj was able to supply us with accurate Bengali because of his proficiency in the language. One time, when in the presence of Srila Prabhupada, some guests, including Prabhupada's god-brother, Krishnadas Babaji, Pinchan Krishnadas Babaji Maharaj, Chaitanya Swami was able to please Srila Prabhupada by his use of Bengali. To one of the guests, Chaitanya Maharaj said in Bengali, "Why don't you go now? Because Guru Maharaj needs some rest. He's not so well. You can come back next Tuesday." Hearing Chaitanya Maharaj speak Bengali, Krishnadas Babaji, who was always laughing, almost rolled on the floor in uncontrollable laughter. He slapped Prabhupada's back, and then Prabhupada also began to laugh. Prabhupada then turned to Krishnadas Babaji and said, "Khub bhalo Bangla jane," which means he speaks very good Bengali. He knows very good Bengali. After this, Prabhupada and his godbrother continued laughing. Akinchan Krishnadas Babaji Maharaj was a pure devotee. Prabhupada stated that. So Paramahamsa would always chant Hare Krishna. The godbrother. Personal. His height. In height, he was maybe 5'5", and non-devotee would say a small man. Most of his disciples stood taller than he, but we didn't think like that he was a little man. If we saw reporters describe him as a little man, it didn't make sense. That was obviously the defective vision of the non-devotee. His servant once said, for someone who is supposed to be small, it takes all your energy to cover his back, to massage it. I can't understand him. His shoe size was 8. His sweater size around 36. The palms of his hands were soft and boldly lined with long, firm lifelines. There was something protective that came out of his disciples in the fact that Prabhupada's height was shorter. We wanted to be sure to protect him because he was so great, so valuable, our spiritual master. In the company of karmis, karmi was Prabhupada's very polite way of referring to non-devotees. Or in the company of devotees, he was regal as he walked with his cane, not at all like a small or old man. Any person, regardless of his physical stature, would approach Prabhupada respectfully, deferring to him. Prabhupada was elderly, a gentleman, and was almost always treated in that way, very respectfully. Because when he spoke, he was very refined and proper. He himself proclaimed his spiritual mission by his every action, and people could see that for themselves. A number of Prabhupada disciples say this, that it was not just the message that Prabhupada was giving, it was Prabhupada's own demonstration of pure devotional service to Krishna that convinced them. Usually accompanying him were his Western disciples who were very worshipful of Prabhupada. That was also impressive. He was not alone, but with his servants. If he looked small, still he controlled others who were tall. Therefore, he was taller than they. He had strength. He would say his mind was strong. His face was not small, nor was his aristocratic nose and full mouth. His eyes were large. Again, these contradicted the small man idea. He was saint, sadhu, not small. He didn't sit small. His voice was deep, could be gruff, loud, commanding, not small. His control of big men like Brahmananda, Jayapataka, Bhavananda was complete. His word, the raising of his eyebrows, or the turn of his mouth could humiliate them utterly or drive them running into action. And he wrote so many books. He was not small. But if he chose, he could be like a child, and he had to care for him completely. That was his love. This is my sex life. In India, Srila Prabhupada was often invited to attend programs in people's homes. Sometimes these people were very pious and became devotees by such contact with Srila Prabhupada. In some cases, they mainly wanted material blessings, health and prosperity, in return for hosting a sadhu and his followers. It's very important to host a great saintly authority along with his followers. On one occasion, Srila Prabhupada, along with 20 of his devotees, was sitting in a man's living room while the man introduced each member of his family. "This is my wife," said the man. And the wife came forward, bowing slightly and folding her palms. "And this is my older son. And this is my daughter. And this is my younger son." Each came forward and said his name while Prabhupada nodded genially. "This is the husband of my daughter," the man continued, "and these are their children." Each both quickly appeared and exited. Finally, all the members had been introduced and had departed, momentarily leaving Srila Prabhupada alone in the room with his devotees. In a confidential aside, Prabhupada spoke quietly to his disciples. "This is my sex life." If one thinks Prabhupada's words are too cutting, he or she may consider the Srimad Bhagavatam statements of Jada Bharat. Quickly show you. Here is Jada Bharat. Jada Bharat is a description of the material world as a great forest of enjoyment. Narada Muni. This is, you will find it in the 6th canto. No, sorry. Yeah, Narada instructs the Pracheta. Or Prahlad Maharaj, 7th canto, wherein a similar estimation is made of family life. Household life and raising a family may also be taken up in a spirit of pure devotion service. But if a genuine sadhu such as Srila Prabhupada in a particular situation calls a spade, no one should be offended. Those who are attempting to carry out the instructions of Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam and Chaitanya Charitamrita should also develop the maturity to understand the reality. You have something for me? Srila Prabhupada once said that whenever a manuscript of his was printed and published as a book, he felt as if he had just conquered an empire. So for his disciples, it was also an opportunity for intimate association, to be able to prepare his books for printing and to bring him an advanced copy fresh from the printer. When Canto 7, Part 2 of the Srimad Bhagavatam was printed, Srila Prabhupada was staying at the New York City ISKCON Center. Rameshwar Swami and Radha Vallabh had gone to the airport and received the first 2 copies by special flight. It was about 2 a.m. when they returned to the temple. Eager to present the book to Prabhupada, they took the elevator up to his rooms on the 11th floor. The light was on in his sitting room. Quietly opening his door, they found that he was not there. They went again into the hall and saw the light on in the bathroom. With childlike glee, barely controlling their laughter, they each hid a book behind their backs and waited, smiling, to present it to Prabhupada. When Prabhupada came out, he saw them and said, "Oh, you're here." He noticed that they were holding something behind their backs and trying to control their smile. "You have something for me?" he said, perfectly reciprocating their mood. He then walked ahead into the sitting room, looking playfully over his shoulder, and invited them, "Come on." When they handed Srila Prabhupada the books, he exclaimed, "Ah!" Immediately took one and touched it to his head. He looked at the cover and then turned to the book and looked at the back cover. He opened up the front page and read aloud the selected epithet verse. He went through the front matter page by page and then carefully looked at all the pictures. Then Srila Prabhupada started reading the book aloud from Prahlad pacifies the Lord with prayers. The joyful presentation party merged into the ecstasy of a Bhagavatam reading by Srila Prabhupada. He read on for about 40 minutes, seemingly oblivious to everything else. When we read Prabhupada's books, when we distribute his books, when we have his books translated into various languages, so all of these activities would bring great satisfaction to Srila Prabhupada, and there are perennial instructions also. It is our duty to ensure that Prabhupada's books are translated into all the languages. There are still several languages in which all of Prabhupada's books are not yet translated. If you know a language and Prabhupada's books has not, all of Prabhupada's books have not been translated into that language, you should start thinking about what can be done to bring Prabhupada into that language. It's most important. Srila Prabhupada, you're not supposed to take anything. There were many inconveniences Prabhupada had to face due to old age and disease. But he was never affected in his pure Krishna consciousness. Even externally, he often refused to bow to the dictates of his maladies, variously diagnosed as diabetes, poor digestion, and many others. He or his followers would call for doctors periodically, but Srila Prabhupada rarely took their prescriptions or followed their diet regimes. He was not what you would call a good patient. When in New York, an Indian allopathic doctor visited and gave Prabhupada medicine and antibiotics, Prabhupada was polite and agreeable, but his servant, Harishori, was doubtful. Will you take your medicine? He asked. Prabhupada patted the little pills on his desk and said non-committally, we shall see. He never took them. Some of the devotees thought that Srila Prabhupada was seeing doctors just to engage them in devotional service. Quite possible. Quite possible. He rebelled against strictures on his diet, even when he was quite ill. A Kaviraj means an Ayurvedic doctor. A Kaviraj in India ordered that Prabhupada couldn't eat rice, potatoes, sugar, and certain fruits. When he called in his cook Daivi Shakti in Vrindavan and asked her to make Punjab Boli, a hot potato sabji, she dutifully reminded him, but Prabhupada, you can't eat potatoes. He endured it for a few days and then overthrew the order. He called for his old lunch of rice, dal, chapatis, and sabji. At that time, another of his well-meaning servants, Upendra, intervened and tried to restrain him. But Prabhupada, the doctor told you not to take all these things. You're going to get sick. Prabhupada replied, we are not Dr. Das, we are Krishna Das. From then on, he resumed his normal diet. In Mayapur, his cook, Palika Dasi, attempted an even stricter discipline based on the instructions of a famous Kaviraj from Calcutta. In this case, Prabhupada used to follow an intricate schedule by which he would take pills and eat and drink only at certain hours. This was in 1977, when Prabhupada was so sick that he was rarely coming down to the temple to give classes or to go on morning walks. One afternoon, a devotee named Anaka Dundubi, unaware of the tight schedule of Prabhupada's drinking and eating, brought Prabhupada a fresh coconut dal to drink as usual. Although Prabhupada knew very well that he was not supposed to take anything at this time, he quietly accepted the dal and poured it into his cup. Just as he started to drink it, Palika came by and admonished him, Srila Prabhupada, you're not supposed to take anything. Prabhupada became defiant. Who said? He challenged. And he immediately drank down the whole cup of juice, although it was usually his custom to sip it slowly. All my life, he said, I have done whatever I wanted. This is Prabhupada. Ayurveda is not very important. A disciple, Satyanarayan Das, had been advised by other devotees that serious study of Ayurveda would be important. Satyanarayan was living in Florida, America, but he planned to go to India to take up the medical study. He had written to a Kaviraj in Calcutta, one whom Prabhupada also sometimes saw, and the Kaviraj had written back, agreeing to accept Satyanarayan as his student. Arriving in Mayapur, Satyanarayan went to see Srila Prabhupada, who at that moment was receiving a massage on the roof of the building. At his disciples' first attempts to explain the Ayurveda project, Srila Prabhupada put up his hand and said, oh, I'm very tired now. It seemed that he was not only tired, but also not particularly inclined to hear. Within a day or two, Satyanarayan managed to get another interview. This time, he entered Srila Prabhupada's room, offered his dandavats, and explained things a little further. I can stay as a pujari here in Calcutta. It's only a mile away to the doctor, and I can study under him. I have permission from my GBC man. Prabhupada interrupted him. No, this is not very important. Then he just looked away. Satyanarayana couldn't believe that he was just supposed to accept it without, with no further comment. He wanted an answer and a reason. So he sat silently looking at Prabhupada. Prabhupada kindly turned to him. We are not interested in studying these different sciences. Whatever medicines work, we use it. Actually, Western medicine is very advanced, so there's no reason to study this. We want to become Brahmanas. Prabhupada pointed to the Krishna book on his desk and said, you simply read my books. That is what you should do. Satyanarayana felt satisfied and said, thank you, Prabhupada. Prabhupada replied strongly, Hare Krishna. And that was the end of Satyanarayana's career in Ayurveda. Satyanarayana thinks that Prabhupada praised Western medicine just to shock me into the right consciousness. Prabhupada's actual conviction was more like that stated in the Bhagavatam by Prahlad Maharaj. Whatever remedies they accept, although perhaps temporarily beneficial, are certainly impermanent. For example, a father and mother cannot protect the child. A physician and medicine cannot relieve a suffering patient. Balasya neha sharanao vidarao nrsimha. The Prabhupada writes in the purport to this verse, unless one is protected by the mercy of the Lord, no remedial measure can act effectively. One should consequently depend fully on the causeless mercy of the Lord. Although as a matter of routine duty, one must, of course, accept other remedial measures. No one can protect one who is neglected by the Supreme Personality of God. So this is something that you notice with Prabhupada, or of anyone who's coming in touch with Prabhupada. There's only one message. Manmana bhava madbhakto madhyaji mam namaskuru sarvadharman parityajam mam ekam sharanam. Stop everything else in life. Simply engage in pure devotion service unto Krishna as presented by the disciplined succession and by him under the guidance of his devotees. Period. That's it. That is what makes him Prabhupada. That's the only thing that he's interested in giving. Because that is all that is required. Because that's what Krishna wants. Prabhupada is only interested in presenting what Krishna wants. All of us will be benefited to the fullest extent if we fully surrender unto Krishna's instructions. Krishna is fully capable of taking care of our material needs and spiritual needs. Prabhupada said on raising children, I discussed the contents of your letter with His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada stated that our Grihasthas should simply chant 50 rounds before conceiving a child. Prabhupada said, we do not want all these rituals. Chanting Hare Krishna is our only business. According to the Manu Samhita, you are all mlecchas and yavanas. You cannot touch the Manu Samhita, what to speak of translating. So if you try to follow the Manu Samhita, then you will become a mleccha and yavana and your career is finished. So this was Prabhupada's clear instruction. Before conceiving a child, before a husband and wife decide to unite to have a child, they are meant to chant 50 rounds of the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra. I understand that you are now expecting a nice child for raising in Krishna consciousness. In this connection, you should avoid any spicy foods so long the child is within the womb. So far, natural childbirth is concerned, natural delivery is possible if we keep ourselves naturally. And so far I know, a pregnant woman should not even eat pungent foodstuffs. She should not move in cars. She should not sit idly. She should move and do some physical work. These are the general rules and regulations I've seen in India. They have natural delivery. But so far your country is concerned, especially the situation of women there, that is a different thing. I cannot say definitely what is to be done. And under the circumstances, the best thing is to consult a doctor as they usually do. And after all, Krishna is the ultimate master. So if you keep the natural habits and depend on Krishna, then everything will be done nicely without any difficulty. You ask if the children should be taken to ordinary medical doctors. Why not? Of course, we can't always trust that these doctors may be doing the right thing. But what can be done? The governing principle for our activity should be to do what is favorable for pleasing Krishna. So if your child requires medical attention to be fit for serving Krishna, then it is only practical. She should get it. The same thing, the government is giving you money, why not use it for Krishna? The only thing you must avoid cheating them while falsely claiming something to get money, then we are risking our very high reputation as pious people. But if they are willing to give us money and food, then of course we should accept. It's very, very important. We are trying to propagate Krishna consciousness. We cannot do something by which we bring about a bad name. That is simply from the from the grossest perspective. It's like when Krishna was talking to Arjuna in the 2nd chapter of Bhagavad Gita. He gave several reasons initially before talking about the spiritual benefits of carrying out his particular duty with a spirit of detachment in Krishna consciousness. He was talking about the material benefits. If you conquer, then you enjoy this world. Or if you die, you go to the heavenly planets. In that context, in one place, he says, what will happen to your reputation? Sambhavitasya chakirtir maranaditiruchyate. For a person who is well established, infamy is worse than death. So there's a role. Fame has its role. So these things should be taken into consideration. Regarding the child problem, in class, I may inform you that our children born of Krishna conscious parents are all welcome. And Krishna conscious parents are all welcome. And I want hundreds of children like that. Because in the future, we expect to change the face of the whole world. Because the child is the father of the man. Anyway, I have seen M is nursing her child so nicely that she attended my meeting every day and the child was playing, not crying. Similarly, L's child also never cries or disturbs the meeting. L was always present with her child. So it depends on the mother how to keep the child comfortable so that he will not cry. The child cries only when it feels uncomfortable. The child's comfort and discomfort depends on the mother's attention. But that is teach all these things. So the best solution is we train all our small babies in such a way that they are always satisfied and there will be no disturbance in the meeting. Then there will be no complaint. But there cannot be any hard and fast rules that only children who are grown up 7 or 8 years old can be admitted and no other children can be admitted. It is not possible. And I am not going to sanction any such rule. Rather, I shall welcome the baby from the very beginning so that the transcendental vibration may enter into its ear. And from the very beginning of its life, it becomes purified. But of course, children cannot be allowed to disturb in the meeting by crying. And it is the mother's responsibility to keep them comfortable and not disturb the meeting. Why should the parents not feel attachment for their children? That is natural. But our affection is not simply sentimental. We offer our children the highest opportunity to become trained up in Krishna consciousness very early, so as to assure their success in this life to go back to Godhead for sure. That is real affection. To make sure my child gets back to Godhead. That is my real responsibility as a parent. And I have seen that Gurukul offers this opportunity more than any other place anywhere. So I think you're an intelligent girl and you can explain it to the others in this way. Prabhupada tells a story. When Shyam Sundar Das was in charge of ISKCON, England, he bought very expensive crystal chandeliers. They cost 3,000 pounds. The devotees had to take them back because they couldn't afford them. On this occasion, Prabhupada was talking about the crystal chandeliers. He said, this reminds me of a story of a Nawab. Nawab means rich one. He has so much money, he doesn't know what to do with it all. So, with it all, one Nawab had one servant cleaning a big crystal chandelier. So the servant was cleaning the chandelier. The crystal fell, and as it crashed onto the marble floor, it made an unusual tinkling sound, which the Nawab heard from his room. The Nawab came running out and asked, what was that sound? The servant was petrified. and asked forgiveness. I'm sorry, he said. When I was cleaning the chandelier, one of the precious crystals fell and shattered on the floor. I'm very sorry. The Nawab said, oh, this is a very nice sound. Throw one more down. So the servant smashed another onto the floor. Very nice sound, said the Nawab. Throw another one down. And so in this way, every single crystal of the chandelier was thrown and smashed on the ground. Because the Nawab had so much money at his disposal, he could do anything he liked. Similarly, said Prabhupada, Shyamsundar thinks he's got so much money, he can just throw it. Personal, his preaching spirit. In the evening, he wanted to see guests. We suggested he not see people who would waste his time, and he agreed. But then he would become angry with us if we kept people from seeing him because he existed for preaching to them. It was his duty to preach, he felt. Prabhupada was self-satisfied and never restless or bored. Yet, if the place was really quiet with no preaching there, he seemed to want to go where there was some action. This was also a manifestation of his desire to accomplish as much as possible. Prabhupada was already accomplished in terms of self-realization and love of Krishna, and therefore his travel was only for the benefit of others. He felt he had to travel, and he kept on the move. When he arrived in a new place, he was immediately ready to see the local people. The room would fill up, and he would preach for hours. This feature of Prabhupada's behavior was astounding. Day and night, people would come into his room, sometimes a few, sometimes many. Prabhupada would always speak to them about Krishna. He would speak on the basis of Bhagavad Gita, calling for verses to be cited, answering questions, preaching as much as in his classes. The informal talks were more unusual. Many of his talks in later years were recorded. If you go to Vanipedia, you go to Vani source, you can see a timeline of Prabhupada's life. 1970. You can see it here. They've divided it by the months. Let's say June. And you can see July 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, whatever they have. There's a link to it. You click any of these and you click it there. You can listen to the audio if you want. Also read it. Very, very useful. Very useful. He would preach. He kept going, hours on end, preaching the basic philosophy, holding the room full of people, then taking a little prasadam and distributing it. When he would travel to certain places, as in Europe, where he could speak to many people and bring them to devotional service, he would be especially enlivened to preach. Preaching included encouraging the local ISKCON disciples wherever he visited, and preaching also meant his book writing. It also meant his spirit of maintaining and expanding ISKCON in all its activities. We cannot describe the full glories of his preaching spirit. His enthusiasm was unlimited, and even today is nourishing all the preachers of ISKCON. When he was ill and feeling inconvenienced, when the people he was speaking to were low class or disinterested, when his body was very old, and when in order to preach, he had to interrupt his schedule, when there was difficulty going on within his ISKCON, still his preaching would go on. Sitting at his low desk talking, his eyes sometimes widening, hands sometimes gesturing, taking water to drink, chanting almost soundless japa when not talking, focusing in on special guests to develop a whole argument with them, Prabhupada was intent on his preaching points, although he had made the same points millions of times. Thus, he was not just a scholar, but a pure devotee attempting to convince everyone that they had to change. The whole world had to change, or else that was the spirit. And that is the spirit Prabhupada wants from each and every one of his followers in the disciplic line that continues from him. The Prabhupada's ecstatic emotions. It didn't happen very often, but sometimes the Prabhupada was overcome by ecstatic emotions while lecturing. It happened, for example, in the San Francisco storefront when Prabhupada was describing Lord Chaitanya's mood of separation from Krishna. It also happened in Gorakhpur, India, when Prabhupada was seated before the deities of Radha Madhav. He said, our own Mayapur, small Radha Madhav, discussing Krishna's pastimes. Again, it happened in Los Angeles during a lecture. He said that his disciples were young and had much opportunity to preach, whereas his life had no value because I'm an old man who may die at any moment. As soon as he uttered these words, Prabhupada was suddenly unable to talk, and a very perceivable change in his consciousness took place. It seemed to some of the devotees who witnessed these states that the spiritual world had suddenly opened up directly before Prabhupada's vision. And Krishna was communicating with him in a way that made him unable to speak. One time, after the same thing happened before a large gathering of devotees in Mayapur, the devotees inquired from Srila Prabhupada about their own behavior on such occasions. In Mayapur, when Srila Prabhupada became stunned, the whole congregation became breathlessly silent. Congregation meaning all the devotees were assembled there. This is the original meaning of congregation. Waiting for a cue from their spiritual master. But suddenly one of the sannyasis broke the mood and began singing Namo Om Vishnu Padaya. At first no one followed his singing, but when he persisted, others gradually joined. And then Prabhupada broke out of his meditative trance. Afterwards, there was a strong disagreement among the devotees over the sannyasis' behavior. Some said it was offensive. Finally, the issue came to Prabhupada's secretary, Brahmananda Swami, who was asked to settle the matter by asking Prabhupada. Brahmananda Swami asked Prabhupada if he remembered how during the lecture that morning he had gone into a deep silence. Srila Prabhupada replied shyly, almost embarrassed, and said, I do not do that very often. But when it does happen, Brahmananda Swami asked, what should we do? Should we be silent or should we chant japa? Prabhupada said, yes, just chant Hare Krishna, that's all right. Brahmananda then asked if what the sannyasi disciple had done that morning was all right by chanting. Yes, said Prabhupada, that was all right. Prabhupada treated the whole occasion as rather insignificant and thus gave his devotees the hint that they should not get involved in speculation. Of course, they could not forget what they had seen, but they should not make a big thing about Prabhupada's going into ecstasy. It had occurred, but it was not his main method of precept, for example. And to chant Hare Krishna at such a time was all right. In Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur's commentary to Srimad Bhagavatam, I'll show you. Here is a chapter. Okay. Yeah. Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur points out that these kind of ecstasies, such as shedding tears or the hair standing on end and so on, they are not manifested by certain extremely grave, greatly experienced devotees when they chant the holy names and so on. But at the same time, we also know that there are other kinds of people who may exhibit these kind of ecstasies. So then how do you know that a person is actually experiencing spiritual ecstasy internally? So then he comes to this conclusion. Hridaya vikriya lakshanani asadharanani shanti nama grahana satya dini eva yeyan. One should understand that the symptoms of there are 9 symptoms of bhava bhakti, which are enlisted here, which are enlisted, summarized by Prabhupada here. Rupa Goswami next describes the characteristics of a person who has actually developed his ecstatic love for Krishna. The characteristics are as follows. He is always anxious to utilize his time in the devotion service of the Lord. He does not like to be idle. He wants service always, 24 hours a day, without deviation. He is always reserved and perseverant. He is always detached from all material attraction. He does not long for any material respect in return for his activities. He is always certain that Krishna will bestow his mercy upon him. He is always very eager to serve the Lord faithfully. He is very much attached to the chanting of the holy names of the Lord. He is always eager to describe the transcendental qualities of the Lord. He is very pleased to live in a place where the Lord's pastimes are performed. For example, Mathura, Vrindavan or Dwaraka. These are externally perceivable and those who are Uttamadhikaris and who have no envy, as soon as they chant the holy names, they experience the sweetness of the pure holy name. And how do we know that? We know that because there are these symptoms of bhava bhakti, and their hairs may stand on end and so on. But they may decide to suppress these ecstasies also. So that is the real way by which we can understand about the spiritual status of such a devotee. It is by checking whether he has all the characteristics of a person in bhava bhakti. So therefore, Prabhupada did not want to make a big thing about this, because there are a lot of cheap people who artificially can shed tears and so on, and in that way misled innocent or inexperienced practitioners of Krishna consciousness. So therefore, it has been appropriately written here. It had occurred, but it was not his main method of precept or example. And to chant Hare Krishna at such a time was all right. Long hair means beautiful. Mahabuddhidas tells of the first time he met Srila Prabhupada. His name at that time was Randy, and he had long blonde hair. He was a football player at San Diego State University, a leader in student government, and a son of wealthy parents. He had been taking part in the congregation Kirtan in the Los Angeles temple when Prabhupada's secretary invited him to come upstairs to Prabhupada's room. Randy liked the idea, but when he entered Prabhupada's quarters, he found himself the only guest in the small room. Srila Prabhupada was seated at his desk, surrounded by sannyasis and GBC disciples, none of whom knew Randy. While Randy was trying to gather his wits about the situation, Prabhupada began to preach, looking straight at him, saying, "Why be a Kripana?" "What's a Kripana?" thought Randy. And Srila Prabhupada replied, "Kripana means miser." Randy thought of his family's wealth and how he and his parents had their own plans for using it. Prabhupada continued speaking about the Kripada mentality. And by now, Randy had the direct impression that Prabhupada was speaking to his mind in defeating each of his defiant thoughts. It was like a conversation between Randy's rebellious thoughts and Srila Prabhupada's smashing spoken replies. Because you have been given some ability, wealth and opulence by Krishna, said Prabhupada, looking to Randy, who sat against the wall. Therefore, you should use it in Krishna's service. If you use it only for your personal sense gratification, that's simply miserly. If you do not take to Krishna consciousness, you will ruin your human form of life. Prabhupada continued explaining the process of devotional service, and Randy managed to resume some of his pride and defensiveness. He began to feel insulted that Prabhupada had called him a miser. Randy admitted to himself that Prabhupada seemed to have read his mind, but if Prabhupada were actually perfect, that he should know the future. In this way, Prabhupada began to feel the return of his usual pride. As if in response to these thoughts, Prabhupada suddenly called for a copy of the 12th canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam and began reading aloud the predictions for degraded humanity in the coming age, the age of Kali. Men will consider that to have long hair means they are beautiful, said Srila Prabhupada. When Randy heard that, he began to shake. He felt stunned. He thought to himself, he has completely defeated me. Several disciples of Prabhupada, both male-bodied and female-bodied, they testify that Prabhupada understood their minds. Little drops of nectar. When Srila Prabhupada flew on planes, his servants carried his silver plates and served him full meals. His disciples usually cooked much more for his travels than he would eat. One time, Srila Prabhupada asked to eat just before the plane was to take off. The stewardesses were making preparations for departure, but Srila Prabhupada's servant brought him his prasadam, which had been recently cooked at the temple. Prabhupada sat alone, undisturbed, as the other passengers looked at him, buckled their seat belts, and put their trays and seats in the upright position. Somehow the stewardesses didn't insist on Prabhupada's confirming, so he continued calmly eating as the jet sped down the runway. His servant anxiously held on to the drinking cups while Prabhupada ate his meal with no notice or care for his surroundings. Only when the plane was high in the air did Prabhupada finish. Turning to his servant, he said, "All right, you can take these away now." At one of his international festivals in Vrindavan, Prabhupada rejected the singing of one of his disciples. The devotee had previously been a singer in a band, and his kirtans were much appreciated by some devotees, especially those from his home temple. But when, with showy professionalism, he began leading the Guru Puja in Prabhupada's presence, making the tune sound like a rock and roll ballad, Prabhupada didn't like it. He shook his head and indicated that someone else lead. The great kirtan singer was devastated by the rejection, another form of Prabhupada's mercy. For a time in Mayapur, two Bengali ladies were cooking a large feast of about 25 preparations and sending it over to Srila Prabhupada at his meal time. But he was eating very little of it. "I'm eating with my eyes," he laughed. He then described how in the old days in Bengal, aristocratic people would invite one another for meals. One would prepare a huge sumptuous feast, and another would come and appreciate how it was cooked and arranged so nicely. The guest would merely look at the feast and say, "Oh, very nicely done." Then all the servants would actually eat it. The atom bomb will go off and it will all be finished. Srila Prabhupada was very good at imitating the sounds of men, animals, and machines. He did not do it by any gross oral manipulations as some modern comedians do, but by the use of onomatopoeic sounds and even Sanskrit derivations. He always did it to prove a Krishna conscious point. One time in Beverly Hills, the Prabhupada gave a whole tour de force of imitative sounds. Prabhupada had been alone writing when a servant went into his room. Prabhupada began speaking. There are so many material sounds. Just now I was listening and I could hear the freeway. Prabhupada then imitated the car. The sound he made for the cars might be written down as ooh, ooh. But it is not possible to capture the actual sound in print or even by imitating the sound. It gave an exact impression of what cars sound like on the freeway. Prabhupada's car sound even included a criticism of the foolish endeavors of the highway rushing karmis. And in the alley, said Prabhupada, the garbage truck is coming. He then made another perfect imitation. I also hear these birds, said Prabhupada. Someone nearby has roosters. Prabhupada then gave a Sanskrit version of cock-a-doodle-doo, which was also perfect. But someday, said Srila Prabhupada, and then he became completely quiet. This whole conversation had been taking place in the early morning in Prabhupada's room. And therefore, when he became silent, it seemed like the whole world was silent. He repeated. And then someday, suddenly Prabhupada imitated an exploding bomb. The atom bomb will go off. It will all be finished. Hippie mentality. Once in Vrindavan, Prabhupada noticed that some of his men disciples were letting their hair grow. Different men had their reasons for growing hair. So Prabhupada had not said anything. But one day, in the presence of his servant, Harishauri, and Bhagavat Das, Prabhupada expressed his displeasure. Turning to Bhagavat Das, he said, "You look very beautiful by keeping hairs. What is your explanation?" "Oh, I was advised," said Bhagavat, "that because I was going to the European countries, it would be required to keep this hair. But they have won victory in the court by keeping a shaven head," said Prabhupada, referring to a recent New York court case. "I asked their advice," said Bhagavat, "whether I should shave or keep the hair." Bhagavat was about to say more, but Prabhupada interrupted him. "What is that nonsense advice? Who is that rascal advice? By keeping hair, you become beautiful. This is without advice, this mentality of growing thick hair. We are known as shaven-headed, the whole society. This is how Prabhupada formed ISKCON. We're supposed to have temple devotees with temple residents. And you're supposed to serve Krishna day and night according to the instructions that Prabhupada gave. Preaching means to convince people to surrender their life fully to serve Krishna in Krishna's temples. Those who cannot do that, okay, fine, they can be at home. And today we call them congregation. That's fine, that's fine. They can do whatever bit they can. But for preaching, you require these kind of devotees. And in fact, there's a letter where Prabhupada points out that for establishing a center, you need to have at least 10 full-time devotees in a center. That is how you preach. In order to accomplish something, you need to do that. Congregation can assist, congregation members can assist, but we need temple devotees to preach. And the men, for them, he gave a dress code. He gave a very clear dress code. It doesn't even like the dress code that Prabhupada gave for the men and women in the temple. They're very, very clear and very specific. Women wear sari, men wear dhoti and kurta, like that. He was very, very clear. He was very clear about a certain dress code and all that. And the men have to shave that hair, mustache, beard, and so on, periodically. Rules. This is how it is meant to be. And when we carry out the instructions of Lord Krishna, of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, as presented in Prabhupada's books, then naturally we will progress in Krishna consciousness. And when we preach, we will help others also take to Krishna consciousness and progress. There's a whole mechanism for that. We are known as shaven-headed, the whole society. Harishauri attempted to explain his own case, saying, "It is about 3 weeks since but Prabhupada interrupted him. "Every fortnight at least," said Srila Prabhupada. And then again, he turned to Bhagavat. "Before going to Europe 6 years ago, you were keeping hairs like that. Oh, I have to go to Europe. That I've seen. You like to keep hairs. That hippie mentality is going on." Prabhupada was expert to notice if to what degree have we not embraced every aspect of his teachings. Prabhupada not only gave us spiritual teachings, he also gave us cultural teachings. Everything has to be accepted because everything is coming from the scriptures through the disciplic succession, which teaches us how to implement the scriptural rules and regulations in such a manner that you can attain the goal of Vedic knowledge. It's 5 o'clock. I'll stop with that. Questions? Just give me a minute, 1 minute. Let me Bankim Govinda Prabhu.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu. Prabhu, you mentioned about prasadam, which Prabhupada said that it should not be wasted. Is there any mention by Prabhupada that prasadam can be kept and eaten for the next course?
For the next?
For the next meal. Usually prasadam cooked should not be kept for more than 4 hours. So
yes, it should be freshly cooked.
Okay, so it should not be kept and eaten. It's
not healthy also.
So in that case, prasadam should not be wasted also, because Prabhupada says prasadam should not be wasted also.
And that is why we cook what is required, and we feed as much as required, and we distribute it all. Like for the restaurant and all, Prabhupada, he pointed out that at a certain point of the day, you should sell off at half rate. And then just before it closes, you can just distribute it off free. The next day, again, you cook fresh. Okay. I think that gives an idea for how we are meant to do things.
Thank you, Prabhu.
Anything else? Otherwise, we can also discuss in the Telegram group. Lavanya Mataji.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu. Prabhu, you were telling one pastime of Prabhupada in Vrindavan when Prabhupada was carried by palanquin. He was actually laughing. So I couldn't understand the reason behind why did Prabhupada laugh. Could you please repeat?
Why they carried Prabhupada?
No. Why did Prabhupada laugh? He was sharing some story, right, in the room. So which I couldn't understand. What was the reason behind Prabhupada laughing?
The man is so poor that all he can do is eat only grasshoppers. But then when he wants to pass stool, he's traveling by a horse. Horses in previous time, okay, say it's like a car. In today's world, you have vehicles, you need a car, which is expensive. So previously, to have a horse means you need to have a lot of money. The man is not even spending money for his food, but for passing stool, he's going royally on a horse. Ridiculous. So Prabhupada, he compared himself to a person like that. And therefore, he was laughing.
Thank you, Prabhu. Hare Krishna.
Okay. How about processed food like noodles? Can it be offered? What did Prabhupada say about that? As much as possible, when you use that apple cider, I think that we can derive some idea from that. Prabhupada always suggested that we prepare ourselves as much as possible. Why can't our own devotees make noodles? That solves the problem. Because Prabhupada makes this point that anyway, if it's when it is manufactured, it's not manufactured with out of devotion to Krishna. So it's better that these kind of pre-processed foodstuffs they can be minimized. Just better take foodstuffs that are. That's another reason why our own devotees should start making these things if at all they think it's if it is realistic. The idea is that foodstuffs are very, very important. They can make us, they can break us. Ahara shuddhau sattva shuddhi. Mind becomes pure when the food is pure. At a certain point, I understood it. And then I decided, no non-prasadam grains. No non-prasadam grains. At least start with that. These are all very important. We should not make things more difficult. When we start eating foodstuffs cooked by non-devotees or this. Anything else? All right. Further discussions we can have it on Telegram. Thank you very much. Patitanam pavanebhyo, Vaishnavebhyo namo namaha.